The memory haunts them still. Former German prisoners, now old men in post-war villages, speak in hushed voices about evenings that changed everything. They describe the impossible sight of American women stepping through barbed wire gates. They recall melodies that bridged enemy lines. Their grandchildren listen in wonder. These stories seem too strange to believe. Back in Germany, rubble fills the streets. Food is scarce. Spirits are broken. Yet these returning soldiers carry something unexpected in their hearts. Not bitterness about captivity. Not tales of cruelty or starvation. Instead, they speak of concerts, music floating across prison yards, women in summer dresses singing German folk songs. "We were addressed as gentlemen," one former POW tells his wife. "Not prisoners, not enemies, gentlemen." The word echoes in his memory. It stayed with him through months of confinement, through the long journey home, through the shock of seeing his homeland in ruins. His family struggles to understand. How could America, their sworn enemy, show such kindness? These accounts spread quickly through devastated German towns. Families expected horror stories from American prison camps. Nazi propaganda had promised starvation, chains, endless humiliation. Instead, they hear of abundance, of dignity, of unexpected humanity. One soldier describes hearing Silent Night sung in both languages, English and German voices blending under guard towers. American women applauding German prisoners for their harmonies. "In that moment," he says, "I knew the war would end. I knew we could be human again." Another recalls the shock of seeing women without fear. In Germany, no civilian woman would enter an enemy prison. The Nazi state forbade such contact, yet American women volunteered freely. They brought sheet music, instruments, smiles. The contrast shattered everything these soldiers believed about their captors. Historians later noted how these experiences shaped post-war attitudes. While bitterness dominated much of Germany's aftermath, former POWs quietly contrasted their American treatment with harsher conditions elsewhere. The memory of concerts became part of reconciliation, part of rebuilding trust in democratic values. But let's go back. Let's see how it all began. The rumors started months before the first performance. Whispers in dark barracks, impossible stories spreading through prison compounds. American communities wanted to send entertainers into the camps, musicians, choirs, women. The German prisoners laughed at such absurdity. Why would America waste time bringing concerts behind barbed wire? It had to be manipulation. Another psychological trick. But the whispers persisted. Anticipation grew despite their skepticism. These men had traveled far from home, captured on battlefields in North Africa, France, Italy, shipped across the Atlantic in guarded convoys. They expected America to treat them harshly. Nazi propaganda painted clear pictures. Starvation awaited them, chains, endless suffering at enemy hands. Yet when transport ships finally unloaded them in Texas, Nebraska, Iowa, reality looked nothing like their fears. The camps appeared orderly, almost sterile compared to frontline filth. Instead of mud and squalor, they found wooden barracks, screened windows, sturdy bunks. Their captors seemed determined not to break them physically. Confinement came with unexpected dignity. Meals arrived with clockwork precision. Plates carried meat, bread, vegetables, even occasional desserts. Far more food than German civilians received back home. Coffee, rare and precious in wartime Europe, appeared almost daily. The abundance of sugar stunned them. This wasn't paradise, certainly. Barbed wire fences loomed high. Guard towers stood at every corner. Machine guns followed their movements. But compared to their fears, the contrast felt disorienting. What struck them most was the sense of routine. Roll calls came at dawn. After that, life settled into rhythms including work details, sports, even books. They received opportunities to study English, take classes, read American newspapers under supervision. Some men sneered at this initially. They dismissed it as propaganda. Yet the fact that such opportunities existed planted seeds of confusion. Their captors weren't interested solely in punishment. They wanted control, stability, perhaps surprisingly, cultural influence. None of them prepared for what came next. The first notices appeared on compound bulletin boards one summer afternoon. A special program would be held, organized by local women's groups, cooperating with the U.S. Army and USO. The prisoners laughed at such ideas, convinced it was some twisted joke. But wooden benches appeared in the recreation yard, a makeshift stage assembled from planks. Disbelief gave way to curiosity. Why would Americans, in the midst of global war, send civilians into enemy prison camps, let alone women? The initiative came from nearby communities. Churches, women's auxiliaries, patriotic societies volunteered to provide concerts, plays, lectures. For many Americans, this demonstrated cultural superiority. Their nation fought not only with weapons, but with ideas, music, compassion. Some simply wanted to alleviate boredom. Occupied prisoners meant less unrest. For church groups, it expressed Christian duty, treating even enemies with kindness. For German soldiers, this prospect defied comprehension. Most had absorbed endless images of America as decadent, dangerous, utterly hostile. The thought of American women willingly entering compounds full of captured enemies challenged everything they'd learned. In Germany, women were strictly shielded from foreign prisoners. Any suggestion of cultural exchange with captives would be condemned. To hear that American women would perform music, recite poetry, even speak to them felt unreal. Like dreams conjured in captivity. The day of the first performance arrived. Guards took extra precautions. Riflemen stood at each corner. Soldiers kept careful watch. The women arrived in cars. Prisoners pressed against wire fell into stunned silence. They expected grim-faced officials. Instead, they saw young women in summer dresses, carrying sheet music and instruments. Some wore hats tilted stylishly. Others carried hymnals. Their very presence was electrifying. For men who had spent months, even years, without female company, the sight overwhelmed them. Conversations died instantly, replaced by hush so thick the entire camp seemed holding its breath. One prisoner later wrote in his diary about that moment. He described perfume scents and female laughter drifting across wire, awakening something long dormant in soldiers' hearts. Another wrote home, astonished that Americans were foolish enough to let their women near enemy troops, but then admitted the experience was profoundly moving. The women greeted the camp commandant, stepped onto the stage. Soldiers sat on benches, staring with wide eyes, still unsure if this was truly happening. The atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation, but also strange softness. The war, with all its brutality, felt suddenly far away. In its place came something entirely different. The promise of music, performed not by soldiers, but by civilians, by women who had entered willingly into the enemy's domain. For the first time, German prisoners realized their captivity might bring not only survival, but glimpses of humanity they never imagined possible. The first notes drifted across the camp yard, tentative at first, then swelling into full sound. A young woman sat at an upright piano, wheeled in by guards. Her fingers danced across keys, playing familiar classical melody. Beethoven, no less, a composer as German as the men listening. The effect was immediate. Astonishment rippled through the crowd. To hear homeland music, played with such care by an American woman in captivity's midst, seemed impossible. Some men lowered their heads, overwhelmed. Others straightened with pride. Hearts stirred by echoes of culture they thought was being denied. After the classical introduction, the program shifted. Another woman, holding sheet music, sang an American folk song. Her voice clear and light. The words were foreign to prisoners. Yet melody carried something universal. Not a march or military tune, something soft, almost playful, describing rural life and hope. Some prisoners whispered translations of fragments they caught. Others simply closed their eyes, letting themselves drift away from fences and watchful guards. The most surprising moment came when performers alternated between German and American traditions. A violinist played Schubert's Ave Maria. Men instinctively rose to their feet in silent respect. They knew this hymn deeply. Hearing it from their captors' citizens made it both comforting and unsettling. Then, without pause, the group launched into spirited Yankee Doodle. The contrast was almost comical. Nervous laughter spread among prisoners. The barrier between enemies seemed to waver, replaced by awkward, shared amusement. Some POWs were bold enough to join in. When women began humming Silent Night, a few voices rose from benches, hesitant at first, quickly gaining strength. Within moments, hundreds of men sang in unison, German words weaving with English versions sung by visitors. The sound carried beyond barbed wire, across fields into nearby towns. Guards shifted uneasily. Even they couldn't deny the strange power of this moment. What shocked German prisoners most wasn't the music's quality, though impressive. It was the intent behind it. These women came not to mock them, not to lecture them, but to offer culture in the most unlikely place. The idea that their enemies could honor their own composers struck them speechless, that they could blend traditions with American songs. Music had bridged an abyss that war itself had dug. By the concert's end, prisoners remained rooted in seats, clapping vigorously, calling out thanks in broken English. For many, it was the first time since capture they felt less like enemies, more like men, still soldiers, still confined, but momentarily touched by something transcending borders. That night, as lights went out in barracks, melodies replayed in their minds, giving them new, confusing images of America. Images far removed from propaganda paintings. The shock of female presence hit harder than music itself. These weren't fleeting glimpses through fences, not distant shadows in towns. These were American women standing before them, smiling, speaking, laughing as though rows of prisoners were simply another audience. Many POWs had been at the front for years. Some last saw wives, fiancés, sweethearts on hurried train platforms before war. Others marched through villages where women were kept distant or silent under strict Nazi discipline. Yet here, their captors allowed women to step openly into camps full of enemy soldiers. The effect was profound. Hearts beat faster. Conversations dropped to whispers. Eyes followed every visitor movement. How they held sheet music, adjusted their hair, laughed between songs. What astonished Germans most was the women's behavioral freedom. In their homeland, prisoner camps meant discipline and rigid separation. No German woman would ever be permitted to mingle with captured enemies. let alone offer them kindness. The Nazi state ensured that. But in America, women spoke casually, at times even addressing prisoners directly. One singer paused to thank the gentleman for listening so intently. That word sent murmurs rippling through benches. To be addressed as gentlemen instead of prisoners or enemies was almost unthinkable. Guards remained watchful, rifles ready. Yet they didn't interfere with this strange exchange. Americans seemed to trust the situation's discipline, confident that barbed wire and armed presence were enough to prevent incidents. But for Germans, the very idea of trust was staggering. They couldn't imagine their own country granting such access, exposing civilian women to men who months before had been firing weapons on battlefields. One former prisoner later described how a single gesture shattered his assumptions. A violinist, after finishing her performance, smiled warmly and waved at the rows of soldiers. The wave was small, casual, utterly disarming. For him, it was the moment he realized war propaganda about America as savage and corrupt was false. If America were truly what Nazi officials claimed, these women wouldn't be here, offering music and goodwill. The emotional weight of these encounters varied. Some prisoners avoided looking directly at women, too embarrassed or conflicted. Others tried to memorize every detail: the color of a dress, the timbre of a voice, the way laughter rang out freely without fear. For men living in captivity's monotony, where each day mirrored the last, female presence shattered dullness, introduced rushes of human warmth that no barracks routine could provide. That night, when gates closed again, camp air felt different. Prisoners spoke in hushed tones, replaying visitor images over and over. Some smiled, recalling phrases or gestures. Others lay awake, staring at ceilings, haunted by memories of what they'd witnessed. The shock lingered long after music faded, reminding them that captivity could contain unexpected moments of profound humanity. In days after that first performance, something shifted inside camps. When women returned for another concert, prisoners no longer sat stiffly in silence. Instead, subtle anticipation filled the air. Buzz of conversation before music began. Soldiers who once scoffed at cultural programs now leaned forward, waiting for first notes, wondering if there might be another surprise, perhaps a song they knew by heart. Concerts gradually turned into exchanges. During one visit, women sang American standards. Home on the Range, You Are My Sunshine. Pieces speaking of ordinary life far removed from artillery thunder and city ruins. Melodies carried images of farms, rivers, sunshine. For listening Germans, it was a glimpse into the America they'd only imagined. Afterward, a group of POWs asked if they could respond with something of their own. Guards hesitated. Permission was granted. That night, in halting unison, men sang Die Lorelei, a song deeply rooted in German tradition. Their voices rose from benches, wavering at first, then swelling into haunting, powerful chorus. American visitors listened in rapt silence, many recognizing the beauty even without understanding words. When the song ended, women applauded openly. Prisoners bowed their heads, surprised by response sincerity. This exchange became a pattern. On subsequent evenings, German soldier choirs sang old folk songs, some wistful, others filled with Rhine or Black Forest rhythms. Women replied with American hymns or popular tunes, blending their homeland's spirit with the stage they shared. Slowly, concerts became less performance, more conversation carried by music, each side revealing cultural pieces to the other. For many prisoners, these shared songs awakened something deeply personal. Some closed their eyes, imagining mothers humming same melodies back in Germany. Others thought of village festivals, weddings, evenings in local taverns before war. The act of singing together blurred captivity's sharp edges. Men who had been battlefield enemies were now exchanging verses with American civilians, their voices mixing in warm summer air. Letters written afterward captured this unexpected intimacy. One prisoner described how women's voices made him feel at home again. Another recalled the thrill of hearing applause directed at a German song, a reminder that their identity hadn't been erased by war. For men reduced to numbers behind barbed wire, being recognized as human beings with traditions worth sharing was nothing short of transformative. These moments of cultural exchange didn't erase fences, didn't soften captivity's reality, but they created small bridges. Fragile, yet undeniable, between people who were supposed to remain enemies. Each song carried a kind of truce, not political, not official, but deeply personal, one that lingered long after last notes faded into night. Not everyone viewed these encounters through the same lens. Among prisoners, many saw concerts as miraculous gifts, reminders that life held more than barbed wire and rations. But American military authorities observed the situation with caution. Each performance brought dozens of unarmed women into close proximity with men who, despite neat appearances, had once been sworn enemies. Guard commanders worried about discipline, about whether emotions might boil over, whether female presence might inspire desperate escape attempts. Behind closed doors, officers debated risks. Allowing cultural programs in POW camps wasn't required under Geneva Convention. It was a choice, one reflecting America's confidence in its security and resources. Some commanders argued such leniency could weaken military authority, or worse, encourage fraternization that blurred lines between prisoner and host. Yet others pointed to benefits. Content prisoners were less likely to resist, less likely to conspire, more likely to cooperate with work details. Music and morale, they argued, were weapons in their own right. Guards themselves felt the tension most directly. On concert nights, they stood at attention with rifles slung across chests, eyes scanning every audience movement. They watched for lingering stares, for sudden gestures, for anything signaling disorder. But they also noticed something undeniable. The way men sat quietly, almost reverently, as if spellbound. On evenings when women sang, there were fewer arguments, fewer scuffles, far less restlessness in barracks afterward. Music, it seemed, was accomplishing something that barbed wire alone could not. Even among American civilians, opinions were divided. Some nearby towns supported visits wholeheartedly, seeing them as moral duty. Churches spoke of extending Christian charity, even to enemies, demonstrating the difference between democracy and dictatorship. Others grumbled that it was indecent to let women step into enemy camps, that such performances wasted energy better spent on American soldiers fighting overseas. Letters appeared in local newspapers, some praising the initiative, others condemning it as reckless or naive. For German prisoners, though, none of these debates mattered. What they felt was undeniable. Women who came into camps didn't treat them as beasts or faceless soldiers. They treated them as men capable of listening, of appreciating, of being moved by music. To hear laughter and applause directed their way was piercing. To see women smiling at them without fear or hatred, an experience that pierced the rigid armor of propaganda they'd once believed. A camp guard later reflected in his memoirs that he'd initially opposed the visits. He'd considered them dangerous indulgence, unnecessary during wartime. But after watching men sit in rapt silence, after seeing how they spoke softly among themselves afterward, he changed his mind. "Those concerts," he wrote, "were the only times I saw them look less like prisoners and more like ordinary human beings." The military kept its rules in place. Fences stayed high. Guards never lowered their vigilance. But despite the caution, concerts continued. For both sides, the value of those evenings outweighed the risks. Music echoed not only across camp yards, but into the memory of everyone who witnessed them. As months passed, concerts became more than passing entertainment. They became treasured events that prisoners carried into their private lives. Each evening after a performance, barracks buzzed with recollections. Men described how a soprano held a high note, how a pianist smiled as she bowed. Some whispered about details that seemed trivial, but were magnified by scarcity. The cut of a dress, the shine of a brooch, the scent of soap carried on warm night air. Letters written after these evenings revealed how deeply concerts touched prisoners. Although every word was censored, many managed to slip past the black ink of U.S. Army censors. One soldier wrote home that he'd seen kindness from the most unlikely of places, describing the sight of American women singing songs that reminded him of childhood. Another, more cautious, told his family that life in America was not what we were told. He hinted at the shock of hearing German folk songs applauded by enemy audiences. Some men described concerts in vivid detail, filling entire pages with recollections. One noted applause sound echoing off barracks. Another, the way comrades hummed refrains for days afterward. These letters, when they reached German villages, astonished families who'd been told their captured sons and brothers were suffering in brutal conditions. For wives and mothers struggling with hunger, the idea that their men were listening to concerts performed by women seemed surreal, even unbelievable. But for POWs themselves, concert memories lingered long after visitors left. Men once resigned to captivity's monotony now found themselves rehearsing songs quietly in evenings, their voices blending softly in practice. Some formed makeshift choirs, preparing to answer American singers with polished performances of their own, as if music had cracked open captivity's shell, letting light seep into camp life's gray routines. In private reflections, many prisoners admitted that female presence had shaken them on deeper levels than they cared to admit. One recalled lying awake at night, imagining his wife back in Germany, feeling longing pangs sharpened by voices he'd heard in camp. Another confessed in his journal that he no longer knew what to believe about the enemy. If American women could treat them with such dignity, perhaps the world wasn't as simple as Nazi slogans had painted it. For some, these memories became survival forms. The thought of the next concert, the possibility of hearing another song, gave them something to anticipate in a life otherwise stripped of choice. The memory of a laugh or melody became threads they held on to during long labor days, or in the silence of their bunks. By the time many men were transferred or eventually repatriated, concerts had become defining experiences of their captivity. Moments that blurred war's boundaries, made them feel, if only for an hour, like part of the world again, rather than prisoners cut off from it. And so the circle completes itself. Those old men in post-war Germany, speaking in hushed voices to their grandchildren, carry these memories still. They remember not the barbed wire or the guards, not the monotony or the confinement. They remember the music, the laughter, the sight of women in summer dresses stepping fearlessly into their world. They remember being called gentlemen, being treated as human beings capable of song, of appreciation, of bridging worlds divided by war. These memories became proof that even in global conflict's midst, enemies could recognize each other not as faceless foes, but as people, capable of kindness, of humanity that no fence, no guard tower, no uniform could erase. The concerts echo still, in memoirs written decades later. In interviews given by aging men, in the quiet recognition that sometimes, in the darkest of times, music can build bridges across the deepest chasms. American women singing German songs behind barbed wire, German prisoners applauding their captors' melodies, voices blending across enemy lines under summer stars. It was impossible. It was beautiful. It happened. And in happening, it proved that